This is Bob. Bob goes to a museum and he stares at the Mona Lisa. He really loves this painting. He's filled with an immense amount of joy. He's experiencing some of the most important fundamental states of consciousness that a human can have. Why am I here? What is the universe? What's right and wrong? What is death? His deepest questions are answered. And Bob also decides that the painting is telling him something. He decides that the creator of the universe painted the painting and it's telling him to kill the first blonde child that he sees. This is Joey. He is a blonde child, which sucks for him. Now Bob is in jail, and we're all like, why the f*** did you kill Joey? And Bob is like, well, this thing says I should. And God totally painted that thing, and so I did. So now we have some questions. First question, is Bob crazy? And when I use the word crazy here, I'm using it in the literal sense of something physiologically wrong with the nervous system in his brain that we can point to here. Bob very well might be, and I'll come back to it, but keep in mind that's the definition of crazy that we're concerned with here. But let's go on. Is Bob's interpretation a problem? Point taken. Is Bob's interpretation wrong? Well, I guess Bob is entitled to his interpretation of the Mona Lisa. Do I have to respect it? Should we add it to art history books? Well, probably not, but he's entitled to his opinion about what the painting means and why the painter painted it. Is Bob's interpretation rational? And this is really the important one. So to answer this question, what we have to do is build a rational range of possible responses to the painting. Because there's clearly not just one way to interpret the painting or one way to interpret the Mona Lisa. There's a range there, and it's quite wide. Someone could look at the painting and say she's beautiful, and he painted her because she's beautiful, or someone could say she's bored, or someone could say this is a comment on feminism, and someone could say art sucks. You could say a lot of things that would all be rational responses, and responses that you could make an argument that would fall into the rational range. But was Bob's rational? Well, the answer is no. There's nothing in the shape of the jawline or the pigment in the eyes or even the life story of the painter that would suggest that a rational viewer should or logically could interpret the painting to be instructions to kill Joey. His response falls outside of the rational range. And keep in mind, when looking at this image, the green area is just rational. It doesn't mean good, and the red area doesn't mean bad. We're just talking rational responses and irrational responses. We could have come up with an irrational response like the Mona Lisa was a prediction of the winner of Survivor Season 7. That's totally irrational and is not the same moral problem as killing blonde kids. So keep that in mind as we move forward. Green means rational, red means irrational, not good or bad. Okay, moving on. Let's swap it out. This is Kevin, and this is the Qu'ran. Kevin loves this book. It does to him all of those deep things that we talked about with Bob. All of his questions are answered. It touches him at the deepest, most profound level. And Kevin reads some particular passages about people who leave the faith and what should happen to them. This is a particular passage from the Quran. Feel free to pause it if you would like. It's 489. And he decides that that is telling him to kill people who leave the faith. After reading the book, Kevin kills this man who was a Muslim but has since left the religion. And now the questions. Is Kevin crazy? Well, he might be, and we should leave the possibility open. But there's been a lot of people who've landed on the same interpretation that Kevin has over vast differences of geography and genetic gene pools. So it's possible that they all suffer from the same mental condition, but statistically nearly impossible. We can almost definitely eliminate a physiological malfunction as the cause of this interpretation. Was his interpretation a problem? was Kevin's interpretation wrong? And here's where we really start getting into the interesting debates between the difference between Bob and Kevin. Philosophically, I suppose Kevin is just as entitled to that interpretation of the book as Bob was to his interpretation of the Mona Lisa. Do we have to respect it? Should we add it to the literature of possible interpretations of the book? Well, these questions are all open for debate, but I can't really call it philosophically wrong. But was it rational? And here we are, of course, again, at the most important factor. So let's build the rational range again, because just like with the Mona Lisa, there's not only one interpretation of this passage or the book that could be considered rational, there's many. Someone could read the book in this passage and say it helps me lead a good life, and someone could say I'm supposed to ignore this part, I just don't like this part. Someone could say that this passage is just a test of our faith, or someone could say that it's talking about an emotional turning your back on someone, and there's many different possible rational reactions to this. But the question on our hands is, was Kevin's particular interpretation rational? And thinking back to the Mona Lisa example, we said no, because there's really nothing in the painting or in the life story of the painter or in the pigment used or whatever that would get the instruction of killing blonde children out of it. But is there something here that Kevin has read that we can get out of it in a rational way? And unfortunately, we can't say no, and I think we have to say yes, that it falls somewhere in the rational range. Now, I'll get to the caveats later that I'm sure you're all thinking. But first, let's stay with this. This doesn't mean there's only one possible interpretation. There's this range here. And within this range, there's interpretations that are totally harmless. There are interpretations which are good or helpful. And there are interpretations which are bad. There's a whole range here. But keep in mind, there's also interpretations that could potentially fall outside of the rational range. If Kevin interprets the book to be instructions that he should travel only via rollerblade and wear purple the rest of his life, that interpretation would just make no rational sense given the words in the book and in the passage that we're concerned with right now. And there's other responses that also don't fall in the rational range, which are totally not helpful and totally harmful. But the question was looking at Kevin's interpretation and asking if it falls into this rational range. And that's where we have the problem. You can almost look at this as a checklist, and it's really the whole point of this exercise is that when something is irrational, it's really easy to dismiss. It's really easy to dismiss Bob's interpretation of the Mona Lisa as a purely irrational one, and Joey, unfortunately, was probably the first victim of Mona Lisa-inspired homicide. But Kevin's, unfortunately, is not so easy to dismiss. Here come all the caveats, which you knew were coming. The first caveat that I just have to get out of the way is, of course, not everybody who reads this interprets it this way. Kevin interpreted it this way, and unfortunately, he's not the only one in the world who has interpreted it this way. The next thing is that not everybody who interprets it this way acts upon their interpretation. Not everybody kills someone like Kevin did in the cartoon, but some do. Next is, of course, these books are all filled with contradictions and competing doctrines, and on one page they say this, and another page they say this, and there's context to all of these things. The paragraph that I plucked out that Kevin was responding to in the hypothetical is just one, and it's surrounded by other paragraphs, and there's other ways to read it, which I hope I made clear in the hypothetical. I kept trying to insist that, of course, I'm not saying this is the only way to interpret it. There are many different ways. So the image that I used before of the rational range growing out of the book probably looks a little bit more something like this. It's just a mess of overlapping, contradicting, conflicting doctrines that you can look at and pull apart. But what's true is the rollerblading and wearing purple interpretation of that passage will probably always fall in a red zone. I don't think you could read it in any way to check mark the rational box of that interpretation. And the interpretation that we were concerned with in the hypothetical, unfortunately, you can make a pretty good case falls in the green. There are some really important people fighting the fight to make sure it goes in the red, or at least that nobody actually acts upon any of it, even if it's in the green. People like Majid Nawaz are out there fighting it, and we should all really support him. And the other caveat is that, of course, you could put other books on that pedestal and get problems and problematic verses and interpretations that are just as bad as Kevin's in this hypothetical. But what's important to notice about that is when you replace the book, and here I'm replacing it with the Torah and Greek mythology, and here's the Bible, you get a unique web and a particular web based on the specific passages that you're dealing with in the content of the book. What's important about this hypothetical is that to judge the rationality of an interpretation, you have to go to the source of what's being interpreted. So when we change the source, we change the web of irrational and rational responses and reactions. And if you put something like Jainist Buddhism on that pedestal, you still get this web of irrationality and rationality, but as you get this web, the interpretations that are harmful and the interpretations that are helpful might move around to green and red zones. It's probably impossible to get an interpretation like kill non-believers into a green zone if Jainism is on that pedestal. And that's just the nature of the source material. And the other huge caveat is, of course, there are geopolitical and economic and cultural and racial and historical factors that all go into play here. The real world doesn't exist as a bubble in this cartoon. And I don't want to deny that those factors are absolutely real, and they influence which interpretations are gravitated towards by whom all the time. And those factors are real. But to deny what we put on the pedestal matters is to deny how Kevin feels in this scene. And in this scene, Kevin feels really, really good.